Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Evan Medeiros, Penner Family Chair in Asian Studies at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. It's my pleasure to host today's timely and important conversation about China and the UN human rights regime with three of the world's top experts on China's behavior on human rights, especially in international organizations. This is part of a broader series of conversations sponsored by the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues, where we're focused on China's behavior in global governance. Today's conversation is about China's relationship with the United Nations human rights regime. China consistently serves on the UN Human Rights Council, yet its human rights record is far, far from unblemished. The People's Republic of China has grown more assertive in international fora, especially on human rights. And within the Human Rights Council, it's increasingly vocal in defending its statist position and its interpretation of human rights norms. And for those reasons, we put together this expert panel to understand the evolution of China's thinking and its behavior in human rights organizations and the procedures it uses to advance its position. Our view is that Beijing's vision of human rights governance and the tools that it employs to navigate them has emerged as a real challenge to the UN human rights regime. So we're very excited to have three wonderful experts to talk to us today from literally all over the world, from Taiwan, from Geneva, and from Washington, D.C. So in alphabetical order, we have Raphael David, who is a program manager for China and Latin America at the International Service for Human Rights. We have Chahao Su, who's an assistant professor at Suwon College at National Sun Yat-sen University in Taipei, and Sophie Richardson, who served as China director at Human Rights Watch and is currently visiting scholar at Stanford University's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law in the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. So we're very, very excited to have three people with three different types of expertise from all over the world to talk about this issue, which doesn't get enough attention. So first, we're going to start with Chahao to lay out the conceptual issues, China's conception of human rights. Is it new? What are its core tenets? And importantly, Chahao, how do they differ from the concepts embedded in the UN human rights regime? And then we'll turn to Raphael and Sophie to look at the issue from a different angle. But Chahao, please, thank you for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you, Evan. And all the panelists today, and thanks Georgetown University for inviting me here for this very important issue. So I would like to put up my slides so that people can follow it easier because it's a big topic. So let me just share my screen right now. So I've been studying how China understands and reworked the idea of human rights. And me and my colleague and I, we started with data mining to go through all the important human rights documents in China to avoid, having any, we want to study this subject in a more objective way. And so what we want to discover is what does human right mean to the PRC, and how has Beijing's human rights conception changed over time? So these are what I'm going to talk about today. Essentially, if we read the important human rights documents in China, we will find out that starting from 1980s to about year 2000, human rights following their Marxist-Leninist ideology has always been seen as a threat. And this is known as the human rights struggle era. And so human rights was understood as an external threat. And so during this period, the Western human rights is it has three characteristics. One is the Western countries are using human rights as diplomacy, and they try to use this diplomacy to interfere with China's state sovereignty, and they attempt to destabilize China and the rule of the CCP. And the third important point, which is delivered by Deng Xiaoping himself, is that China, as a late developing socialist state, China has a different view from the Western countries. So through our study, I try to summarize there are three major elements in China's construction or reconstructing the idea of human rights. And so after 2000, after China entered the WTO, essentially they decided that, if we continue, like there will be a point when we will be interrogated, being questioned by all the Western major powers in the world. So we need to figure out a way to deal with this issue. And that was when the idea of human rights rhetoric or discourse in China started. And there are three major elements. The first element is what I call collectivism. It means that in China, the protection of collective rights trumps individual rights. So in other words, in China, when they talk about human rights, they talk about the rights of the majority, not the individual rights. And second is the Marxist ideology of historical materialism, which essentially define the Western human rights idea as a bourgeoisie idea of human rights. And instead, in China, they want to talk about the class struggle of human rights. So talking about human rights is also about talking about class struggle. And the third element is called sovereigntism, which means that sovereignty or state right is the trump of all rights. Only when the state and government is capable and powerful enough to guard the rights of the majority, then it is a true human rights. So according to these views, the Western paradigm of human rights are they wrongly assume that their idea of rights is a universal, and that China has its own way of looking at the rights issue. And so it's almost like a relativist idea of human rights. And to save time, I'm going to go to a few graphs that we did in the past. So if this is what we did. We went through People's Daily, 人民日报, for about 60, 70 years of 人民日报. And we use data mining and machine learning to pinpoint for each reference of the word 人权, which is human rights in China. And when we look at it, and this is what the result is. And we can see that starting from 1986, the mention of 人权 started to rise up. And in entering 21st century, it goes up and down. But there is a very, very interesting point that I want to point out in this graph. So we talked about the UPR, which is the Universal Periodic Review, and the first time China was reviewed was in year 2009. So if you look at this chart, you will see that the first three reviews that China has received so far, if you look at the timing, so February 2009, October 2013. So our data only goes up to 2015, and so we can only record, before 2015. But if you look at these two timelines, you see that the mentioning of human rights goes up instead of down, which means that China has changed its attitude on speaking about human rights, and China actually tries to emphasize more on their own understanding of human rights. And so if we look at the next graph, you will find, so this is once again, we found that in recent years, from human rights struggle, which means human rights as threat, recently China has been tried to redefine the idea of human rights in China as the human rights as the state capability, which means again, when the more powerful the country is, the more the country can do more good things for the people. And so we defined all the topics we found, and we found that so in recent years, especially after 2009, which, mind you, is the first periodic review, the narrative about human rights as state capacity goes up and officially surpass the idea of human rights as threat. And also, if once again, this graph shows again that every time when there is a periodic review, the mentioning of human rights goes up. So to briefly conclude, so the idea essentially that this new idea of human rights that China embraces it and is actually very, very daring to talk about in UN Human Rights Council is this new idea that we have a powerful state that we can take care of our people and we provide them welfare and good social service and good public goods. And therefore, we lifted historical record of people out of poverty, and so we are doing well. And that's sort of explaining that China gets more and more bold in talking about human rights, especially in the UN arena. That's my introduction. Thank you, Evan.
Oh, well, thank you, Chahao. Absolutely fascinating. Now, I've got a couple questions that I'd like to follow up on. So your argument is that historically, Chinese views of human rights are focused on collectivism. Of course, that's well known, right? Collective rights are more important than individual rights. You talked about materialism, the idea that economic and social rights are more important than political and civil rights. Again, an important concept, but not a new one. And then sovereigntism. So your argument is that this focus on social welfare, and maybe we could call it public goods, is the newest and latest evolution of that thinking. Am I understanding your argument correctly?
That's exactly right. Yes.
And where does that come from? Does that come from, for example, the prosperity that China has enjoyed, per capita income is rising, there's a larger middle class in China? Does this come from responses to external challenges to China, right? Western democracies promoting their views, China's effort to respond to things like the Arab Spring. Where does this new conception come from? Why do you think it evolved?
Um, we call it, I mean, which I do not mean, and I didn't say that, so in the chart, we didn't mean that the human rights as a threat has completely been replaced by this new idea of human rights as state capacity. What we meant, in fact, the title of our article is called Double Speaking Human Rights. So what we found, so the reason we found this is only through, we went through 50, 60 years of People's Daily, and we literally read into what they have to say about human rights. And so, for example, Arab Spring is considered a very, very bad thing in China because it actually is an interference of state sovereignty, and it also destabilizing the country. So that is the Western idea of human rights diplomacy. So they are still talking about this. That's absolutely true. But at the same time, they are trying to legitimize their own new idea of, or new framework of human rights. I mean, and it all came from the idea of social and economic rights. And yes, with China's economy getting stronger and stronger, especially in the first decade of the of 2000, yes, they are getting more and more confident in talking about how much they have done to the poverty issue, to women's issue, to this physical disability and that kind of thing. So yes, this is a new way of talking about human rights, and this is actually, I would say that they think they find out a way to defend against the
Mhm.
Western discourse of human rights, because they are trying to say that, you see, we're doing far better. We have achieved something that has never been done in human history, and that is to get 600 million people out of poverty. Has anybody ever done that? And this is in a way. So on the one hand, they are attacking the UN human rights idea, and on the other hand, they are trying to defend themselves from their own angle.
Right. So in other words, this sort of newest evolution in their thinking is a way for them to take UN conceptions and human rights and say that we're doing it, but we're doing it better than you are. Is that right?
And yeah, that's
Uh-huh.
right. That's right. Yeah.
What
And
about,
and
and please go ahead.
no, I was just saying that, and also, like, from the frequency, we can see that they talk about it a lot more whenever there is a periodic reviews. So clearly they are not scared of talking about this issue anymore.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. And how do you think about the rise of Xi Jinping in the context of how they talk about human rights and this latest conception?
Um, I think he strengthened this whole narrative. Actually, the whole thing started from Hu Jintao's time, but
Uh-huh.
we found that in Xi Jinping's time, he talks about the importance of a strong governance. So that's the first thing. We find that Xi Jinping strengthened this new discourse, and talk less about the human rights as threat. And the second thing is that it is under. So we found that he is much more engaging in talking about the human rights issue. And so, for example, we can
Mhm.
see that a more regular human rights white paper. We can see that, for example, there is a NGO. It's actually not an NGO; it's a government-run NGO, but it's called Human Rights Association, and they have this very important journal. They call it Human Rights Journal, and and
Mhm.
yeah, and if we read through that, you will find that they use this channel to promote this new idea, and this is the Chinese model, the human rights with Chinese characteristics, and
Mhm.
they are not afraid to talk about it. In fact, they will be very proud to share with the world how
Mhm.
China is doing better on this matter.
And Chahao, last question for you. How much resonance do you believe this idea of human rights as state capacity and China being better at providing these domestic public goods, how much resonance do you think that has with other countries around the world?
Resonance,
Do they agree with it? And who agrees?
yeah. I mean, obviously, it came from a completely different theoretical foundation. Um, it is from our view, or from the traditional human rights view. When you start a person's rights from collective rights, that's actually really strange. So I my 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 take would be this. So if we can see that China cares about the human rights issue more and more, and they are actually more willing to do that. Um, for me, what I see is that it is an opportunity for us to continue to raise these issues and put pressures on, because now they think that they have to reply to these issues. And
Mhm.
yeah. So what we used to call this shaming and bashing. But I think that this is you know, the kind of thing that we should continue on doing, because we know more. We know now that they will reply to the criticisms for sure. So I think that this maybe, if we look at this from a different perspective, I think that, you know, we should keep on going what we used to do, and perhaps it's going to work better than before.
Okay, well, as we shift the conversation from the conceptual to the practical, I want to invite Raphael to join us to talk about China's current presence and activities in the UN Human Rights Council, and in particular, its engagement with the Council's Universal Periodic Review process, which I believe is every 4 years, and China just completed its 4th review. So, Raphael, talk to us a little bit about how the Chinese operate within the Council, and what arguments they use, how the latest Universal Periodic Review went. Talk our listeners through this process and the tactics and techniques the Chinese have used. So please, over to you.
Thank you so much. I firstly wanted to first thank Georgetown for this invitation, and I'm really glad to be here with great fellow panelists, having the pleasure of working with some of them. It's really good to actually go after Xiaohao, because it's really helpful to precisely have someone so excellently lay out the foundations of the narrative that the government advances, because it's very similar to the arguments that they advance here in Geneva, being the foremost space for human rights diplomacy globally. Perhaps just a premise to trying very succinctly to sum up the action of dozens and dozens of diplomats and a lot of money and such a short time. But perhaps just a premise in terms of what we understand as a presence, right? I think that what's very interesting from Xiaohao's perspective is that we can understand the agenda that China is bringing. And I think it's always important when we talk about the presence of a country, or in this case, China, in such a space, to understand that all countries have a presence, all countries have agendas. And that, from also a human rights advocate perspective, we're looking at this not because it's China and we have, of course, a premise of what we think is better or good, but because we look at this agenda, and it is an agenda that antagonizes human rights as the UN understands it. And so this is from that perspective, we try to look at the tactics and which are the standards that they're looking at, which are the tactics that they're using to counter those standards. I perhaps just wanted to very briefly do an overview of the objectives that they have had over the past, or what we see as the objectives that they have had over the past couple of years. Of course, I'm not in the mind of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, nor of a diplomat. I would love to have that knowledge perhaps one day, but we can only infer at this stage from what we see in Geneva and all the actions that they take. I think that the first thing to understand is that for a long period that overlaps with what Xiaohao has said, the government was not necessarily very active, mostly, taking positions to defend its own situation against criticism whenever it would emerge, but not necessarily as a very influential actor in the Human Rights Council, which is the UN's top decision-making body on human rights. And we have a couple of turning points as we see it. So first, of course, in 2018, when a UN committee, so the Committee on Racial Discrimination, revealed, if we can say, to the UN the existence of mass detention camps in Xinjiang. That was followed by China's 3rd UPR, and very rapidly the government had to shift its position and decided to go more aggressively defend its position in that space. That, of course, overlapped with the withdrawal, the very fortunate withdrawal from the Trump administration, or the US, from the Human Rights Council, which was seen as an opportunity for Beijing to step in terms of influence and leverage. And we definitely had a second turning point in 2020 and 2021 at the peak of COVID diplomacy. And we saw how Beijing was incredibly more influential and assertive and confident with, in particular, Global South, and as a Global South leader at the Human Rights Council. So I think that, first, of course, Beijing wanted to first, avoid criticism. That is foremost the main objective that the government still has. That includes, of course, silencing the dissenting voices and silencing the ones that do not agree with all the, of course, the concepts that the government has about human rights, and actually have to view as Chinese citizens that human rights are very different and human rights are universal and human rights or inherent to every human being, regardless of the position of the government or the culture that we come from. And that's, of course, something that the government doesn't want. And the government has used a range of tactics to prevent civil society from speaking at the United Nations. So, I could extend myself hours on this. My organization, the International Service for Human Rights, jobs precisely to open those spaces for civil society. But just to give an idea, that goes from restricting access to civil society inside the UN by blocking accreditation of NGOs or giving them UN consolidated status at the UN, to try to put pressure on the UN to not give badges to NGOs when they want to enter the UN. That happened most recently in January during China's UPR. And of course, reprisals, which is what we understand as any act of retaliation against anyone that seeks to cooperate with the UN, China being one of the top perpetrators of reprisals as documented by the UN. So that goes from being harassed or prevented from boarding a flight to Geneva to being photographed in the rooms to being directly threatened in a side event. I mean, I see Sophie nodding, but basically we could go in a full list about those, and they're documented by the UN. The second thing, of course, that they do in terms of silencing criticism that comes from the UN technical bodies, so UN experts that we call special rapporteurs or other UN committees, is to attack them, either their mandates, the purpose of those mandates, but sometimes the person itself with some ad hominem attacks, as well as to demonstrate support from others and really build this idea that there's a West versus China narrative. I think that the government half believes that human rights are a Western thing, or wants to believe, because it's much easier for them to paint the world as a black and white picture of the West wanting to contain China, and China being the leader of the rest of the non-Western world. The second thing is that, of course, they want to, I think that has evolved from avoiding criticism to wanted to understand that they need a global geopolitical space that is more favorable towards those positions, so more actively want to shape that geopolitical space alongside like-minded governments that have started to emerge. So other authoritarian governments, but sometimes with some, aligned points with governments such as the Trump administration, where they shared actually some views on a couple of human rights issues, unfortunately. That has taken the form of, creating groups of friends, such as something that we call the Group of Friends of the UN Charter, which advances a very, conservative anti-rights agenda that is very much focused on state sovereignty over human rights, a more conservative view of human rights on, for instance, gender, LGBTI rights, and China applies a lot of transactional diplomacy. So basically, I will give you a vote on this issue on gender or LGBTI rights, even if I don't care that much, if in exchange you help me, push my agenda on sanctions or push my agenda to protect myself from any criticism. But of course, in this, you also have the articulation of a vision in the UN system. That is that the UN system shouldn't be focused on the individual and the victims and the rights holders, but should be a space, and the Human Rights Council should be a space for what they call as win-win cooperation. So a space in which states are there just to have friendly discussions about best practices in protecting human rights or delivering, basic services to their populations, regardless of accountability and regardless of civil society. This is what they call win-win or mutually beneficial cooperation, and they have a resolution at the Human Rights Council about this, and they gather other states around it. And the third one, I would say, just before concluding, is of course that they want more and more, and we see it, to assert themselves as a leader from the global south. I'm Brazilian myself, so this is something that I also try to look through the perspective of different regions. But really wanted to be the only leader of the global south and to speak on behalf of a global south to reinforce this narrative of the West versus China view on human rights. But that disregards, of course, the diversity of views from different global south societies or countries. And that takes the form of resolutions or even friendly joint statements with the purpose of gathering support and demonstrating that they're a constructive, responsible actor. That takes also the form of being leaders on agendas that are important for developing countries, such as the right of development or economic, social, and cultural rights, where traditionally Western countries have not had a very good leadership. And that also taken the form of reappropriating itself the idea of double standards, the idea of politicization. I think right now this discussion is very interesting because it happens in a context where the West is very criticized for, blatant double standards in situations such as Palestine, and that's strongly used by the government, by the Chinese government, to assert leadership as a moral leader on human rights. I will not say more about this, but I would be really glad if perhaps our Georgetown colleagues could also share the link to the Minister, to Wang Yi's speech to the Human Rights Council a couple of days ago that very nicely captures everything into one statement. But this is where we are geopolitically, to conclude that the government reinforces that idea. And this is a little bit how the UPR, the last UPR in January, played out. And that's what the government wanted to reinforce this idea that there's a group of Western countries that have one vision. We have another vision, and we're supported by this batch of friends from the developing world. And of course, as Chahal said, this bench of government organized NGOs or gongos to inflate this idea that China is a responsible leader and that the world, and it has the backing of the developing world.
Thank you, Raphael. That was extraordinary, fascinating on so many different levels. So a couple questions come to mind. First, it sounds like the Chinese have moved in the 4 universal periodic reviews from a very defensive position, trying to prevent people from criticizing them, into a position that could be, we could call it active or even offensive. In other words, promoting Chinese ideas and Chinese concepts, and even promoting sort of global acceptance of that. Is that an accurate interpretation of your comments, Raphael?
It is. There's definitely nuance, because I think it depends on the agendas, but overall, I would say that there has been this shift in the policy.
And tell us a little bit about how the UPR process works. Is it a majority vote? What is the voting process, and how do the Chinese sort of operate within that voting process to sort of claim that there's widespread acceptance for their views?
Sure, and that's a very good segue. I think you should just briefly talk about the last UPR in January, which was one of the few moments we can have a very clear state of affairs of geopolitical positions on China globally. The UPR, so the Universal Periodic Review, is a process that was created with the Human Rights Council in 2006, around those years, to respond to a criticism that was kind of like the reason why the predecessor of the Human Rights Council was closed, which was that there was a politicization of human rights. There was an over-focus in some countries, including on China. And therefore, every country requires scrutiny. And so we created this process through which every 5 years, it's a peer review process. So every 5 years, 4 to 5 years, one country's human rights record is reviewed by all the other governments. So on principle, the idea is that everyone is scrutinized, and that any human right are scrutinized regardless of the international treaties that you ratified. And on principle, if everyone engaged genuinely on this, the idea is that you base yourself information from civil society, you base yourself on the extensive information from the UN system, and you base your recommendations off this to address the challenges that a government has, more or less strongly depending on where you're from in the world. But of course, it is inherently an intergovernmental body, and therefore an inherently political body. So recommendations definitely are a reflection of your position towards a country, and the bilateral relation has an impact, in particular when it comes to a country such as China. So concretely, what happens is that China comes to Geneva, says, for the past 5 years, I've done X, Y, and Z, that is good and that is bad. You can imagine that it's more good than bad. And then all countries that registered, which is the vast majority of UN member states, have, well, this time, close to 40 to 50 seconds only to issue a list of recommendations to the government. So from the perspective of the government, there are 2 things in particular in the last UPR that were clear, which is that there was first an objective of demonstrating global support, but for the West to China. And I think the government is very comfortable with this,
And how do states do that, Raphael, during the process? Is it just statements by their perm rep? Is that basically it?
Correct. So they have permanent missions here in Geneva, and they issue statements at the Human Rights Council saying, we welcome China's progress in this, and we recommend 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's a list of recommendations that gets into a report, and you can see them afterwards. What China does, of course, is to try to get friendly recommendations. So this means that they put immense pressure on developing countries at all levels, in Geneva, in their embassies in Beijing, at the capital level, with hostile threats to, that the bilateral relations at stake, to really push them to say something friendly and not talk about the sensitive issues.
How many states are in the Human Rights Council right now and participate in the UPR process?
There are 47 members of the Human Rights Council that have the right to vote, but that's not connected to the UPR. Every single UN member state can participate in the UPR. It's disconnected from the membership of the council itself. But if I may, just to flag perhaps that the other thing the government wants to do with it is to portray itself as a constructive actor, because it engages in the UPR and use this as an argument to show to overlook all the other instances in which it doesn't cooperate with the system, when it attacks, the High Commissioner for issuing a report on Xinjiang, when it restricts civil society access. So the argument is to say, look, I am a responsible actor because I've engaged in the UPR. And the main, I think, outcome, and I'm curious, of course, of Sophie's thought about this, but my two main takes from the January UPR is that despite the immense pressure that was put on a lot of countries and the fact that, yes, the vast majority of the developing world did issue friendly statements, you had a small group of countries that were almost exclusively from Latin America, from left to right. So countries from the developing world, but that have very strong human rights foreign policies. Unfortunately, it's not including my country, Brazil, but the other, yes, that issued good recommendations, although in a different language, less confrontational, but good recommendations that indirectly address sensitive issues and that address the question of cooperation, calling on China to give access to UN experts. This is something that in 2018 had not happened, and that, again, given the pressure, given the current geopolitical context that is really, revolving around Gaza and how everyone positions itself in Gaza, I think was admirable from those countries and opens a breach in the government.
What countries, Raphael?
So, if memory serves, Mexico, Chile, Colombia, Peru, Uruguay, the Bahamas, Costa Rica, and Argentina.
Really? That's it. So again, all of their recommendations were constructive. They weren't just pandering to Beijing. Is that what you're saying?
To various degrees. So some of them were really good. Some others where you had to read a little bit more in between the lines. Some were on issues such as business and human rights. Some others talked directly about access for UN experts. But overall, I would say that there were bold recommendations, in particular for the recommendations they would do for any other country if it was not China.
Interesting. Well, I know in Latin America, there's a lot of conversation about the new left. So maybe, a human rights conscious left. So maybe we're seeing the green shoots of some of that. That's really interesting. So final question for you, Raphael, which is sort of about the tone of Wang Yi's presentation. And we've shared the text of it. Raphael very graciously sent us the link and we've dropped it into chat. So Raphael, sort of give us a sense of sort of the tone and the feeling. You had mentioned before we started that the foreign minister and Politburo member Wang Yi actually came for the UPR. Can you just sort of talk about what the feeling of that was? And let me just remind listeners, we have set aside some time for Q&A. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and please feel free to drop questions into Q&A. But Raphael, sort of the feel. What was Wang Yi in action? What did it look like? What did it feel like?
So, well, my first reaction was that I think that it was kind of like a State of the Union address, if you want. I think he really captured, he really dropped everything that if you wanted to do a masterclass on, China's vision of international human rights, that's what he would drop in there. So all the concept that it pushes for, a vision on sovereignty, but also an argument again, and I think that's how it starts, and that's how it ends, to assert itself as a responsible, credible leader. Again, this is not saying that I agree. This is, I think, the argument that it's trying somehow to make, which is that in a very chaotic world, it advocates for a vision of human rights where, we don't confront each other, we don't interfere in each other's politics, and that China can be a credible actor in ensuring a system that is like that. So I think that it's, for me, in that sense, it has a little bit of that focus of summarizing the vision of the government. And saying it pretty confidently because it is confident of its position right now, not only because it was just re-elected to the Human Rights Council, although with less votes. I don't want to, of course, overlook this fact, but also because, again, we cannot read human rights issues in a siloed manner. We have to read them in a broader context. And the current context at the Human Rights Council, if we don't talk about China, is that there's always accusations of double standards. But I think there was, just various degrees, some recognition of some principal positions from the West in some issues that, kind of like, whether we agree or not, that moral superiority that the West thought it had on human rights is crumbling down, and we see it every day in Geneva when it comes to their awful response to the genocide. And that's the context where things are happening right now, and that is something that we definitely see the mission, of course, using to again to criticize double standards. While when we look at the other side of the spectrum, of course, the absence of any Human Rights Council action on situation in the Uyghur region is the other side of the double spectrum of the double standard. Sorry, if we talk about the global south. So yeah, I think that this, and I'll just conclude by saying that we really have to distinguish between the real confidence, and that's really hard to know, and what we infer from the signals that the government wants to send. So, one thing is whether the government is confident or not. I think the UPR, they drew lessons from it from the global south. There's other resolutions where other global south countries are increasingly dissenting from China on standard issues. We have to distinguish this from the confidence they want to display to the world as a potential, credible global south leader and, new hegemon, whatever you call it.
Yeah. Well, Raphael, very articulate, very, very interesting, fascinating stuff. We will come back to in the Q&A. So last but certainly not least, we have to invite Sophie. We were colleagues that worked very closely together when I was in the Obama administration, and she would hound me from Human Rights Watch, doing her job very valiantly. And we want to bring Sophie into this discussion to talk about the evolution of China's relationship with other aspects of the UN human rights regime, the role of NGOs and advocacy groups domestically and internationally, especially under Xi Jinping as he's constrained civil society in China, and sort of just generally, Sophie, you've had an extraordinary career. You've spent much of it looking at human rights in China. So we couldn't have this conversation without you. And so, we'd like to just get your thoughts on the sort of all of the issues, the conceptual issues, the practical issues, and where are we in the evolution of China's relationship with the broadly conceived UN human rights regime, not just the council, but human rights more broadly.
First, Evan, thanks very much for inviting me to join you, and it's great to be here with Raf and Jiahao. I think we're at an important moment to have this conversation because we have to, I think, start with the threshold reality that we're talking about the Chinese government, which continues to commit atrocity crimes targeting Uyghurs, but horrific human rights abuses against other communities as well. And not only does it continue to enjoy and expect impunity for these crimes, these are some of the worst crimes under international human rights law, it's also actively trying to change the international human rights system that it doesn't have to worry about the possibility of impunity at all anymore. And we'll come back to that in a minute. Evan, you set me, as usual, three impossible questions, or three big questions that are hard to answer in a short period of time. But with respect to the Chinese government's evolution regarding the institutions, not just the bodies in Geneva, for example, but also some of the bodies that are part of the General Assembly in New York, the Third Committee. I think we should also talk a little bit about the 24 UN agencies that have a presence in China, all of which theoretically have a human rights mandate. It's supposed to be a priority across the system. We see almost no activity, I think, from those institutions in that regard. But as we've already talked about, when the Chinese government rejoined the UN system and became more engaged in the human rights architecture in the early 80s, it was a fairly tentative approach. There's a great book by our good friend, Professor Rana Seo Inboden, that looks at some of the Chinese government's initial forays into different treaty bodies, into the change from the Human Rights Commission to the new Human Rights Council, and into institutions like the ILO. And I think it's fair to say that we are now in a time when Beijing is really busting norms, serving as an incredible barrier to accountability and to, I think, setting some very worrying trends that governments that are concerned about these institutions really need to focus on. We aren't just dealing with impunity for crimes against humanity and genocide. We aren't just dealing with the fact that Beijing has now refused for decades to actually ratify the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We aren't just talking about the fact that it has yet to bring its domestic definition of torture into conformity with what a treaty it signed decades ago requires it to do. But we're also now watching the Chinese government become the leader of certain kinds of initiatives that are clearly designed to limit and erode rights, to try to change, I think, the focus of an institution like the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to focus more on issues that Beijing thinks it will appear to be a good player on without a lot of pushback. And we see, as Raf just mentioned, the Chinese government really pushing challenges to norms and practices that are, in my view, designed to diminish a role, if not completely exterminate a role for independent civil society and leave these institutions wholly in the control of states, of governments, but also really to do away with the idea of accountability and instead reduce UN human rights mechanisms to arenas for dialogue. And on that point, I will note.
And so if I can just interrupt you for a sec, how is China doing it? Just give us a sense, a couple examples of how the Chinese are trying to, diminish the role of civil society, for example.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to recall how hostile Xi Jinping's regime in particular has been to civil society domestically. And right. I want to completely agree with Jiahao's descriptions of how the Chinese state and the Chinese Communist Party and the cottage industry of institutions it backs talk about human rights. That's not how human rights defenders from China talk about human rights. They're speaking the language of the international treaties. They're trying to make use of the mechanisms to, for example, take cases of torture to the human rights experts who can respond to those cases and try to bring a degree of accountability. But Xi's regime has quite assiduously sought to effectively eradicate that community and certainly to prevent its ability to interact at all with the UN human rights system. Raf made reference to the Reprisals Report. This is a UN human rights initiative that tracks governments that go after human rights defenders specifically for trying to engage the UN human rights system. And Beijing consistently tops the league tables in that regard. But it also seeks to limit international organizations too by trying to object to their accreditation, which literally makes it difficult for organizations to be part of certain kinds of discussions.
Sophie, what's the status of accreditation in Hong Kong now? Are there any international human rights organizations that can get accredited in Hong Kong?
That's a great question. I would have to look it up, but Evan, maybe a better way to explain, at least for the purposes of this audience, is to talk about, there's been some good recent work showing, which kinds of organizations are blocked from getting accreditation or have their applications deferred simply because they make reference to Taiwan as an independent country. And so even organizations that don't actually do any work on China run the risk of not getting accredited because somewhere in one of their footnotes, there's a reference that some Chinese diplomat doesn't like. And it has real consequences for how NGOs can operate, particularly ones that want to interact with the system. And it's partly because, a block of authoritarian governments sit on the NGO committee. I think there's a lot of room for democracies to do a better job of challenging them and how that committee actually operates to open up that space. So there are a lot of different ways. Raf made reference to a human rights defender who tried to travel from Beijing to Geneva just about a decade ago. She was blocked. She was arbitrarily detained, and she died in detention just about 10 years ago. These are the lengths that the Chinese government will go to prevent people from interacting with this system. Just to try to answer the third question that you put to me, I also want to remind everyone, the international human rights architecture exists because governments fail. they fail to prevent human rights violations. They commit them themselves. And so independent actors are incredibly important in holding those governments accountable, in bringing facts forward, in trying to find redress for victims. It's a system that can't just be the purview of states. And if you're a human rights defender from the mainland, you don't have opportunities domestically to seek justice. You don't have opportunities inside the country to get any sort of redress for the problems that you're facing. And one of the Chinese government's most effective tactics, I think, in limiting domestic NGOs has been to refuse to sign on to the protocols in a number of the treaties that allow for individual cases to be brought forward. It's a real flaw in the system, and we can talk more about the implications of that. But I also think NGOs are playing an incredibly important role in sounding the alarm about threats to the UN human rights system itself. And it's partly because as users of the system, they are often among the actors who encounter the problems themselves of trying to make a submission only to have it knocked back because some Chinese diplomat didn't like it. Dealing with high commissioners for human rights who do not want to challenge Beijing, despite the fact that it's part of their mandate. Even the accreditation process, as we just discussed. But I think NGOs are also remarkable repositories, both of institutional memory about how these systems work, especially because there's a lot of change. They're fairly Byzantine. And of course, of tactics. And the Roth's organization does incredible work trying to make a very complicated system more accessible to precisely some of the people who need to make use of it because the governments in the places that they're working on are hostile to direct interactions. So maybe I'll stop there. I do have some points of optimism we can talk about, but maybe we can come back to those in a minute.
No, that's wonderful, Sophie. It prompts a couple questions from me. Number one, how much success do you think the Chinese have had in manipulating and changing the UN human rights regime? I know that's a broad, undefined term, to reduce criticism of their practices and expand support for their ideas. How would you assert, if you had to grade them, how are they doing, Sophie?
I think they've been extremely successful in staving off meaningful consequences in that, there is not, for example,
for themselves,
meaning, that there is not an investigative mechanism yet set up to, gather evidence with a view towards prosecutions for crimes against humanity and genocide targeting Uyghurs, that we've seen come to pass or get set up, for example, for Myanmar or for Syria. I don't think they've succeeded in diminishing criticism. Roth just described some of the interventions that were made at the UPR that were, I thought, encouraging. And there are some instances in which, Evan, honestly, their overzealous efforts to try to limit discussions, I think, really wind up backfiring.
Sure.
Over the last couple of years, sending notes verbal to all UN members states saying, don't go to this panel discussion that's focusing on, what's happening in the Uyghur region, I think tends to actually produce the opposite response.
Mm-hmm.
Right. How about, so Sophie, you make a great point that the Chinese have been very effective at eliminating criticism to themselves and trying to raise the costs for criticizing China. What about diluting the broader human rights regime? Are there areas where you feel like the Chinese have influenced rules or norms that don't really have to do specifically with China per se, but sort of getting to the excellent issues that Jiahao raised? Like, are they starting to change how the UN debates and discusses issues?
Well, and even how I think certain issues are conceptualized or examined. We don't have time to go into all of the details here about, for example, a very concerted push to look more specifically at economic, social, and cultural rights, all issues on which I think you could very easily make the case the Chinese government has failed pretty spectacularly. We're having this conversation while Chinese government officials are backing bulldozing 2 more monasteries in Tibetan areas. I don't think they're going to win a gold star on cultural rights these days. But they have taken a very well-resourced, long-term, assiduous effort to make those issues more central, particularly to the work, at least of the Office of the High Commissioner and other bodies. And
those issues being economic and social rights.
Yeah. And that distracts attention away from resources going elsewhere, because governments have, and parts of the UN system have to respond to that debate. It creates an opportunity, I think, for exactly what Jiahao is describing, to impose the Chinese government's own conceptualization of those issues as a global norm. And it's very difficult to get democratic governments who I think are a little bit detached from this whole system, because people in democracies don't generally have to rely on those institutions, and so don't pay much attention to them. It's very difficult, I think, for democratic governments to respond effectively, consistently over time with the resources they need to actually stay focused on black letter human rights that we're talking about in the institutions that are meant to support them.
So I've got a sort of final question for everybody, and I'm going to ask each one of you to answer this. But of course, the big issue when we talk about China's human rights behavior is its treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And the UN Special Rapporteur's report, I believe, designated China's treatment as crimes against humanity, and which is, I guess, a sort of one level below genocide. So the question I have for all of you is sort of, how do you think the UN system has done in addressing the plight of the Uyghurs, and how do you evaluate how effective or ineffective the Chinese have been at trying to manipulate the UN system, since that is sort of the big high-profile, human rights issue when it comes to China. So Jiahao, you've been very patient listening to your colleagues. How would you answer these two questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need well, this is going to be strange, but I'm going to say a very cliche word, which is the global civil society, because the way I see it is that we're clearly seeing that China learned the learning curve. We are clearly seeing that China has learned to play the game, and because it is exactly because the United Nations is a society of sovereign states, and that that makes the promotion of human rights a little bit harder. And so we always find that the UNHRC, the High Commissioner, like they went to Xinjiang, but she went to Xinjiang, but the report sounds almost harmless, and that's because China has designed a particular set of viewing spots, and also a rhetoric. So, for example, it's what the Westerners call the concentration camp. They call it an educational institution, for example. And so that makes it harder to actually find evidence. So the first issue is, how do we find evidence? And that's what I've been trying to do. Try to first detect, to find more evidence. If it is not willingly given by China, then we have to find other ways, data mining, for example, to understand how this system works. So that's the first thing I would say. And the same goes to Xinjiang. We tried an initial attempt on how China talks about Xinjiang. And what we found was actually very, very interesting, was that whenever inside the country, whenever China talks about Xinjiang, it's always about touring. No joke, it's always about touring. There's nothing about the plight of the Uyghur people and so on. So so that's one thing we find out, and so we think about how we do next. And the second thing is that, you know, there are several important cases that we can work on, and you know, last year I signed up a petition to nominate Ilham Tohti, one of the Uyghur scholar, to nominate him as the Nobel Peace Prize candidate. And I found those things are, the kind of things that we used to do, but we started to think that, as Sophie just said, that we start to think that, oh, that's too much out of our reach. But there are some things we can do, from small places. And I do think that the global NGOs are extremely important in doing so. By keep on pressuring and keep on exposing these issues where, a state department, an official from State Department cannot do. And I do think that we need to, focus on these areas, and if there is another case, like the case of Liu Xiaobo, who won Nobel Peace Prize, and if Ilham Tohti can also be considered, I think those will eventually put more and more pressure on China, and they will have to do something different. The other thing is that, in China, sorry, let me just make this point very quickly. So the idea of human rights has been extremely securitized inside the country, which means that there is literally no living space for any real NGOs. The NGOs you see in China were pretty much state-owned or state-operated, which we call Gango. And so, if and especially under Xi Jinping's time, this becomes more and more obvious, and especially after now there is an anti-spying law, which literally this makes people unable to go in, and if you go in, you try to do any sort of organization, you could get arrested, even if you are American. So the way I think about this is that we should actually try to talk more and put more pressure, and because China is now trying to shape play a part in shaping the global governance, they have to deal with these issues, and just keep going, keep pushing. That's my thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So Raphael, two questions to you. How do you think the UN system has done with the plight of the Uyghurs, and how do you sort of think about China's tactics and techniques, on that issue? What lessons should we take away from how China addressed that issue?
Thanks. Again, I think we should just do actually a series of a couple of hours on those different issues, because there's so much to say. But
yeah, of course.
And I will not give you a simple response, sorry. But the first thing that I think it's really the key point to understand and to approach this question is to understand that the UN and its complexity. I think it's often that when you see on the media, etc., we talk about the UN. The UN roughly is two things. The UN is the political part of it, that is all the parts that are composed of governments and they're as good as what the governments make out of it, and their part that is more independent, if you want, that is more expert, there is more technical. And there's a huge gap here. And when it comes to China, I don't know if there's any other situation in which there's such a huge gap between the lack of action from governments from the political parts of the UN and the technical parts. So it could again take forever, but if you just look at the past 5 years, we have dozens of letters from UN experts to the government documenting a lot of different aspects of crimes against humanity against Uyghurs. We have, of course, the excellent UN Human Rights Office report that concludes the possible commission of crimes against humanity and ties it to an analysis of law and policy, and says very importantly, as Sophie started with, that the conditions for those crimes to be committed are still in place, and therefore it's not just the past, but it's happening now. And most recently, we had even a UN technical body, the Committee on Racial Discrimination, who emanates from a treaty that China itself ratified, so voluntarily, if you want to impose on itself, that issued a very rare urgent action letter that basically calls on the government to, redress the situation and refer the matter to the UN Office of Genocide Prevention and Responsibility to Protect. So from that side, that is really good. Of course, we could enter in a big discussion about the specific role that the previous High Commissioner, current High Commissioner have that has, I think, more down than up. But leaving this aside, there's a huge gap between these and the lack of action by the political bodies. We have a series since 2019 of joint statements that are supported by countries to call out what's happening in the Uyghur region and put pressure on the government. But China is pretty successful in mobilizing more countries or bullying more countries in the global south into joining a counter statement to say, actually, what we're doing is fine and you should not interfere. And we were very close to, opening a dialogue, even, investigating, just opening a dialogue about the situation in the Uyghur region in September 2022, right after the Bachelet's report, and where there was the first ever resolution on the Uyghurs at the Human Rights Council, which failed by a very, very narrow margin. And that was because of a couple of key votes from the global south that should have, in particular from Latin America, but a couple of Muslim countries, that should have gone towards a yes or an abstention, and instead went to an abstention or a no, and the resolution failed. So the gap definitely is huge. That definitely is a reflection, if we look at the political bodies, about about China's diplomatic political clout, that is clear. It was definitely the result of China's incredible pressure, despite the overwhelming evidence that in any other country situation, those governments would have voted in favor or taken more action. That is absolutely clear. But that's very different from China's possible influence in the UN system from the expert part. There's a lot that has been said about, does China control the High Commissioner? Does China control the UN Human Rights Office? Does China control UN experts? I think that despite everything, there have been incredibly active UN experts in saying so. And I think that the government's actually influence is very much inflated. And I think there's always a risk in global narrative to say China's manipulating the UN, because it's not. We have to acknowledge that the system is working, what it is working. And I'll just end this with, I think, a message of more about multilateralism, which is that I think very often we tend to want to approach this issue of China in the UN system or in the UN or the UN Secretariat as a matter of how can we identify this country that is malign and contain its presence. And I actually think that in the current context, it also happens in a broader geopolitical context where there's other authoritarian governments that don't have a pro-human rights agenda. And the response is really in reinforcing the multilateral system. Again, to share with you a perspective from the global south, it doesn't work when you go to a global south country to say this is the free world versus the rest, and we have to contain China because it's bad. That doesn't work. What you have to do is to propose a positive, progressive human rights agenda through multilateral spaces that doesn't single out one country as being the reason for all evil. And that is the way to get on board other global south countries. So we have to reinforce multilateralism. The US has a role to play in this in different ways. And everyone has to play by the rules. And again, your inaction or lack of action on other issues, or the fact that you're not paying your dues because it's blocked in Congress right now, or your disengagement from the council in 2018, those things have an impact on how you're perceived, or how you're perceived by others and in the system. So the response is multilateral.
Yeah. Very well said. Very well said. Okay, Sophie, the questions are over to you.
I'll try to do this quickly. Are we where we should be given these institutions and their mandates? No. And I think if just about any other government in the world had arbitrarily detained upwards of 1 million people for years at a time simply on the basis of their ethnicity, their culture, their religion, their language, we would be well under sail to some kind of accountability proceedings. So I do think the current reality is very much an expression of Chinese government power throughout this system. That said, the resources that Beijing has spent and has had to spend just defending on this particular issue, I think, are noteworthy. If you took those out of the equation, I think we might be in a little bit of a different place. That said, I think the future depends in part on how certain actors take this forward. The Chinese government basically takes the position that the OHCHR report was not really legitimate or valid and essentially refuses to engage on it. I'm extremely concerned that the current High Commissioner Volker Turk is approaching this issue seemingly from an effort to dialogue with the government as opposed to rigorously assessing whether the recommendations of the report have actually been implemented and pushing ahead with the possibility of accountability proceedings. And that's what's supposed to happen when governments commit atrocity crimes. So I think there's also a lot of work for governments who are concerned about the integrity of the system and about the specific issues to make sure that they are matching and exceeding the resources, the ambition, and the goals to make the system work for everyone. And maybe I will just close with the following thought, which is that, I strongly agree with Raf's point that the loss of the decision memo vote about Xinjiang in October 2022 was very narrow, sufficiently narrow that it suggests that with more work and preparation, an initiative like that could be won. Let's also recall that the number of votes for China in the last couple, for the Chinese government in the last couple of Human Rights Council elections has probably not been what Beijing wanted. And in one case, it came perilously close to losing, which should be a good motivating factor for rights respecting governments from the region to run. And last but not least, victims, survivors, human rights defenders from across China need the system to work for them. And I think in that spirit, we have to make the system as robust and as responsive as humanly possible.
Yeah, very well said. Very well said. Okay, so we have just about 20 minutes left, and I've got a whole slew of different variety of questions. So I'll start with the some of the shorter ones first. So we've got a question here that asks, in a state-based system like the UN, who are China's partners in backing China's approach to human rights? And maybe my guess is that there's probably different categories of partners. Who'd like to take that one on?
I'm happy to get the ball rolling, but I'm sure Chao and Raf will have additions to make. I mean, look, when you're sitting in the Human Rights Council during UPR in January, as Raf and I were, and listening to the interventions go by in these rapid fire 45-second interventions, the point at which you can stretch your legs a little bit or breathe is when North Korea and Venezuela and Cuba weigh in, because that all they've got to say is to offer up platitudes. But it can vary very significantly by issue. Certainly, it's been of concern and interest that member states of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, who have historically been, very quick to call out Islamophobia and persecution of Muslim communities worldwide, have been not just silent with respect to targeting Uyghurs, the Chinese government's targeting of Uyghurs, but in many instances chosen actually to praise the Chinese government's policies in that region. Pakistan probably leads the pack in that regard, but I'll let my colleagues jump in.
Yeah, Raphael, who are China's partners?
Sure, I guess if I can dare to make a comparison, activists in China, they're detained on a crime that is called inciting subversion of state power. And they're distinguished between those that incite and the ringleaders. So let's say who are the ringleaders of inciting subversion of the international human rights regime? You have, a group that is called the UN Group of Friends of the Group of Friends of the UN Charter. So that's a group where China has a very particular role in mobilizing, and they're about 2021, and they're countries that actively promote this view, that is very anti, human rights accountability, very state-centric, sovereignty over human rights. Usual suspects, we can share the list later, but it's available online. They were more active in New York, and now they've opened an office in Geneva, and they coordinate statements and, defending themselves in resolutions. They are the ringleaders. For the ones that incite that subversion, if you want, you do have some that are, countries that don't necessarily love human rights. They don't necessarily need a human rights regime. They're not fundamentally opposed to them. But when you had before in the past, an overwhelming majority of countries that supported the international human rights regime, they would not oppose it. But now you have another pole of power that doesn't really like it, so they're happy to side with them. And that's a range of countries in the developing world, but also in Europe. And lastly, you have, of course, the occasional supporters. So where China actively plays a transactional diplomacy card. So to give you again an example, and that happens a lot with a couple of countries from the OIC that Sophie mentioned, whose agenda so far is clearly anti, sexual and reproductive health and rights, LGBTI rights. And so in those, they need the support of countries like China, where the government doesn't necessarily love it, but it's not necessarily their main fight. And in exchange, they want their support for China's own resolutions on, win-win cooperation, on development and human rights. And so there's a very active transactional diplomacy element.
And who are some of the transactional countries, Raphael?
I'd say it's a lot of countries in the OIC. Now you have a very big coalition that is mostly led by the OIC. So that's across, mostly Asia and Africa and the Middle East. But you have a big anti-rights movement that is focusing, in particular on those two issues, the LGBTI rights, focusing on the T and SRHR. And they're a very big strength, unfortunately, now in the system. I would say that that's where China draws most of its occasional support on other issues.
Interesting. Jiahao, did you want to come in here, or we can move to the next question?
Yeah, no, I think Sophie and Raphael has done a pretty good job. It's just that I just want to add one thing, because the states, it really depends on what you're talking, which issue, which exact issue in human rights are we talking about. So, for example, in the case of Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, as just Sophie just said, the Central Asia countries recently has changed their attitude, and that's I think a lot of it has to do with China's business trading with them, and especially the purchasing, the guaranteed purchasing of natural gas and gasoline from those countries. And so in those cases, like even they were all Muslim countries and they are more sympathetic to the Uyghurs, they are willing to take refugees to a certain extent. But at the UN level, they would, at certain times, they would even endorse China.
Can Taiwan play a role here, or are there Taiwan NGOs? Obviously, Taiwan's not a member state of the UN, but does Taiwan have any sort of diplomatic activity in this area, Jiahao?
Sadly, no. We are not allowed. I mean, this is an area where China has an absolute power over this issue, over anything that is related to UN. So we can't even invite anybody who works for the UN to come to Taiwan. It's that hard. And so, yes, we do have human rights civil NGOs who talks about these issues, works on these issues, but it's hard for us to speak on the international stage.
Right.
Yeah, Evan, can I just add really quickly? I want to put that point. I think it's scandalous that a robust democracy that has fantastic experts on human rights, people who are incredibly knowledgeable about human rights as a legal matter, as a practical matter, can't even set foot in these buildings. It's outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous.
But even as non-government experts, Sophie, they can't? I ask because I genuinely don't know. You mean because they're citizens of Taiwan?
Correct.
You mean because they have Taiwan passports, they're not allowed?
Our passport is a unidentifiable document for the UN.
Right. I mean, Evan, we could have a whole separate conversation about who literally is physically able to walk into these buildings, and on occasion, who's taken out.
What about dual citizens?
Happens.
If you let's say you have a Taiwan passport and a UK passport, can you go in under your UK passport?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes. Yeah. So I go to New York. I cannot set foot in the UN building.
It's outrageous.
Outrageous indeed. Okay, another question here. Are there any positive insights we can glean from today's conversation about China and the human rights regime? I know, Sophie, you had mentioned that you were sort of thinking along these lines. What are the silver linings, right? We don't want everybody to think that it's just the future is entirely bleak. So,
sure. Well, look, to me, one of the tremendous human rights success stories, of the last 30 years, it was the rise of fantastic independent civil society activism across China on issues that ran the gamut from, local literacy all the way through to, very, very, very specialized interventions on finer points of international human rights law. And those individuals and organizations did that work partly in recognition that they would not find much purchase within their own system. And I think as long as people continue to want to try to do that, and that they set as their standard the international human rights system and the covenants as they're written and as the Chinese government has signed up to, that it's in everybody's interest to support that work and to try to ensure that UN human rights institutions remain open to those people. That to me, that aspiration I find extraordinary, and one that's well worthy of concern and support. You know, the answer can't be to just accept the status quo of the Chinese government's position that these people and organizations shouldn't exist, shouldn't have access to UN systems, and
Right.
that only state-organized and backed entities should speak on behalf of 1.4 billion people. So I think that impulse, that work that orients towards the UN human rights system is remarkable in its courage and resilience.
But hasn't it been substantially circumscribed by Xi Jinping's policies?
It has, but Evan, I hate the phrase, responsibly managing relations. That to me is, how much lower could you set global ambition for dealing with Beijing?
Well, I believe technically it's responsibly managed competition, Sophie.
Okay, well, let's go out. I don't want to responsibly manage competitions on human rights. I want to win them. All right. And those people who are trying to do that work are essential in that fight. And so it's not good enough to just decry and arrest. It's not good enough to just say, that Beijing should release X and such activist. Democracies have to significantly up and change their games if they want to see progress, not just on human rights, narrowly circumscribed, which I would never argue for, but on a whole host of issues, right? It's Xi Jinping has made his agenda incredibly clear, incredibly clear. I'm still waiting to hear what democracies have to say in response, because on this, it's not good enough.
Right. Jiahao, silver linings, positive insights.
Wow. Again, I think one of the things that is important is to spread the words. It is important because somehow I believe that most countries in the world are still believing that the UN Human Rights Council really is promoting the idea of universal human rights. But we need to know that what this is actually happening. And I have a good reason to believe that whatever we're talking about today, there are like experts who already know about the game that China is playing, but I believe that there are not many people who know about this still. And so my take has always been like when we can get more people to know what kind of game they're playing, then we can find out the holes in their narratives, right? And so the more you know how this works, the more you know about this game, the better you can deal with it. And that goes the same to all the democratic countries in the world, whether it's European Union or United States. It's the same for every country to know that, okay, now it's a different game. So we need to have a new strategy. We need to think about when Wang Yi says, that China has done better than any other countries, how do we respond to it? Like that it's actually not that hard. Just that, I don't represent anybody, but I believe that, people who are smarter who work in the government, they can figure out how to respond to these, narratives.
Yeah. Great. Raphael, silver linings.
So I have two. I had the benefit of going after Sophie, so I had a little bit of time to think. But so I'm overall pretty much an optimist. I always want to see the glass half full. So we've told about the glass half empty for an hour and a half. I just want to give 5 minutes of the glass half full. But the first thing is to really kind of like put things into context. And we're not just talking about, a dictatorship. We're talking about the first and second biggest economy in the world. We don't have a lot of precedents at the Human Rights Council of holding such a superpower that invests, as Sophie said, so much money, diplomatic capital into this top priority, which is to avoid criticism. we don't really have a precedent in how to deal with this. And so, not overlooking all the failures of the past and of other governments in holding, China accountable at the Human Rights Council, I do think it is a success that we have such a strong, report by the UN Human Rights Office for Uyghurs that had never heard this from the UN before, that we have countless letters by UN experts, that we still have statements from the UN side. I think, despite the pressure and despite, the context that this is happening, reminding ourselves when a couple of years back when George Floyd was killed, and we brought George Floyd's family to the council to try to bring a resolution that was focusing on the United States. It was incredibly hard in the efforts that were put to not include the United States. So, these are things to put in context in terms of, us versus a superpower. But still, we're managing, and I do think that we are actually earning small victories after small victories. And again, getting back to the UPR, I don't think a couple of years back, in particular after the failure of the Xinjiang resolution, we would have thought that we would have good recommendations from a couple of developing countries, knowing the pressure that we know that they had. So for me, that's a sign that we're moving from this, bipolar world that China would like to see very black and white to actually more nuance, more complexity, and a new position from other global South leaders on human rights, and that's something that I'm hopeful for. And my second silver lining, if I can finish with this, is to remember that in the end, I don't really care about whatever government thinks or does in China. What I care is about how human rights defenders inside the country, the victims and those that are detained, care about this. And something that we keep on hearing despite everything is how much of a beacon of hope every single statement by a country, every single letter that a UN expert, puts out there, every single tweet that goes out to the UN Human Rights Office or whoever, is for those that have to wait, 4 or 5 years in jail. That is the single thing that gives them moral resilience to continue, and that gives their family the moral resilience to continue. And in some cases, we've had improvement in conditions of detention or access to a lawyer. So those small wins are still wins. And in the end, that's what we need, right? We need an international system that is able to support the human rights movement inside China and to keep on give this moral resilience, no matter the obstacles.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a wonderful point, and I think it's a wonderful point to end this conversation on. Raphael, David, Jiahao Su, Sophie Richardson, thank you so much. There's not enough conversation about everything China's doing in the UN on human rights, so we appreciate you taking some time out of your day today to advance this conversation. This webinar is part of a broader series we're doing on China and global governance, and in particular ways in which China seeks to shape global governance, often in ways that diverge from universally accepted Western norms. So thanks to all three of you for joining us today. This was absolutely spectacular. And to those of you that are watching, please join us for the next webinar in this series. Have a great day, everybody.